He is the most charismatic figure amongst Eurosceptics, apart from Boris Johnson. And whereas Boris Johnson's star doesn't shine quite so brightly as it once did, Nigel Farage is probably still reasonably bright.
Now, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, will speak to Parliament at 2:30 this afternoon to update MPs on the government's plan to reduce immigration. But Richard Tice, the leader of Reform UK, has said he's held numerous discussions with Tory MPs about their anger over the government's failure to deal with the increase, though he's denied offering Lee Anderson, the current deputy chairman of the Tory party, a lot of money to make the switch. So how big are reform as a threat to the Conservative Party? Sir John Curtice, Professor Sir John Curtice, the pollster's pollster from the University of Strathclyde, joins me now. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Patrick.
So we are hearing an awful lot about Reform UK of late, be it defections or their perceived role as challengers to the Tories on the right. Is that borne out, all this media noise, is that borne out in the polling data at all?
The answer to that is, for the most part, yes, but there is a debate going on about just how reliable that polling data is. So on average now in the opinion polls, Reform are running at about 8%. That is the highest level they've been at in this parliament. And in truth, if you track back through this parliament, essentially Reform started moving up from around the 3 or 4% mark to 6% plus at around the time of the Liz Truss fiscal event. So as support for the Conservatives fell away in the wake of the Liz Truss regime, some of that loss of support has perhaps gone to Reform. Now, why do I say there's a debate? Well, there's a debate because, of course, one polling company, Ipsos, don't do their polls online. They do them over the telephone. And they are typically still getting smaller levels of support for Reform, around 3-4%. And meanwhile, it's also been observed that in parliamentary by-elections, even in constituencies with quite a substantial Leave vote in 2016, Reform aren't performing at a scale that we might expect, given what the online polls have been telling us. Now, that said, even if it's true that perhaps the online polls may be exaggerating Reform's strength, of course, those parliamentary by-elections have not exactly given the Conservatives good news, more broadly speaking. So if the voters weren't going to Reform in quite the way we expect, that didn't insulate the Tories from losing a lot of ground. And equally, the Labour lead over the Conservatives in Ipsos's poll, again, is pretty much on a par with everybody else's. So there's a debate about just how Reform is, but even if the polls may be exaggerating Reform, it's not obvious that where you find that Reform aren't doing quite so well, perhaps, that therefore the Tories are doing noticeably better.
Would Nigel Farage returning as its leader, obviously Reform UK, formerly the Brexit Party, led to great effect by Nigel Farage, now led by Richard Tice, who has a much lower profile and name recognition, would Nigel Farage taking up the leadership again be helpful for Reform?
I think the answer is that probably if I were trying to think of the worst thing that could possibly happen for Tory MPs in the next 6 months, it probably is that Nigel Farage would return as the leader of the Brexit Party. That said, we do need to remember that in the end, it was Nigel Farage's decision early on in the 2019 general election to essentially put up the white flag to the Conservatives by saying that his party would not stand in constituencies the Conservatives were defending. That pretty much in the end gave the election to Boris Johnson, and support for the Brexit Party fell away. Richard Tice is very, very clear that he now believes that Reform UK, Brexit, i.e. Brexit Party Mark II, should now stand in every constituency and should do so, even though clearly it could cost the Conservative seats. So the question mark must be as to whether or not, if indeed Mr Farage were to return, he and Mr Tice would be in agreement on that strategy. If Nigel Farage comes back and does what he did in 2019, then it would be good news for the Conservatives. So I think we would need to know much more about how Mr Farage would lead this party if indeed he were to come back. But sure, he is the most charismatic figure amongst Eurosceptics, apart from Boris Johnson. And whereas Boris Johnson's star doesn't shine quite so brightly as it once did, Nigel Farage is probably still reasonably bright.
Well, Professor Sir John Curtice, pollster at the University of Strathclyde, thanks very much for joining us.